Good evening. Welcome everybody to this online chat that is organized by the European Student Think Tank. Our topic tonight is coronavirus and Europe. And actually, coronavirus in Europe, is this a thing? Just before we get into the topic, I would like to introduce the European Student Think Tank and, of course, the panelists of this discussion. My name is Christos Tsagaris. I'm currently serving as one of the editor-in-chiefs of the European Student Think Tank. 1 week ago, I received a very interesting article from Aparatzeia, my panelist here, about the coronavirus, of course. And while discussing the article, we had the idea of why can't we make it more interactive and turn it in an online chat and have more people embark on this and give their opinion and share their knowledge as well. So the European Student Think Tank, as you may already know, is a youth organization, an NGO based in Amsterdam in Netherlands. It is a pan-European movement which has a network of ambassadors and researchers all over Europe. It has a keen interest on all the aspects of European policy. In the last year, we are giving a lot of effort in making it more inclusive in terms of science, health science, and medicine. Covering emerging public health issues such as the coronavirus is something that is a high concern for us in the EST. And we are really happy to have writers like Aparatzeia, who is tonight discussing with us, that are also interested and knowledgeable in this topic and will share their insights. At this point, I would like to give the floor to my panelist to introduce himself, the organization that he represents and that is collaborating with the European Student Think Tank in holding this event. And just before this, I would like to thank Internet Medicine and John Bennett for stepping in this effort and supporting us. So, Aparatzeia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christos, for this warm welcome this evening. My name is Aparatzeia Shankar. I'm the public relations ambassador for Medical Students on a Mission, also called MSOM. I'm the public relations ambassador for the Pleven branch. Medical Students on a Mission is a Bulgarian registered non-governmental organization. Our organization firmly believes that healthcare is something that we have to go out to give to other people. And our focus is on providing healthcare to underserved and vulnerable and at-risk communities around the world. We've had prior projects in Sri Lanka, Nepal. Now we are going to be working in Bulgaria more with a greater frequency. And we also have some more focus towards Nigeria as well. We have held camps ranging in oncohematology, ocular health, hypertension, cardiology, and so on and so forth. And of course, I would like to thank Christos once again for inviting me on this webinar and to be a member of this panel. I'm also a writer for the European Student Think Tank. My focus is mainly on public health and public, the public impact, the public health implications of policy, especially here in Europe.
Perfect. Thank you very much for being here today. Nice hearing from you. And now I will start with a question. As you know, this online chat will have the form of a Q&A, and then we can move on the discussion with all of you participating and giving your points, your insights, whatever. So, to start with the coronavirus, let's define this. What is the novel coronavirus?
So the novel coronavirus is a new beta coronavirus strain that is provisionally designated 2019 NCOV, also called 2019 nCoV. It has been recently discovered. A projected date is somewhere around the 31st of December, when the first cluster of pneumonia cases was attributed to this new coronavirus. It shares some genomic characteristics with SARS, almost 79.9%, or between 79.6 to 79.9% with the SARS virus. But it is more similar to bat coronaviruses. So it is a new strain of coronavirus with some inclusions from beta coronaviruses that are mostly predominant in bats. I would also like to direct my question to Christos to see how is the coronavirus different from, this coronavirus is different from other coronaviruses.
Well, you actually covered a part of this. To be honest, we all know that coronaviruses are the viruses that cause the common cold. And we, at this point, we can ask ourselves, how can things go so messy? Well, the difference between the novel coronavirus and the coronaviruses that we usually encounter in patients with cold is biological and clinical. When it comes to biology, the genetic material, the RNA of the virus is kind of different. This is too technical to go deeper, but there is a different sequence in the RNA, and actually this is a different identity of a virus. This is, of course, in the same family, but yet it's another member of the family. And when it comes to the clinical features that make it different, this is what is of most interest, not only for us who are in the medical sector, but for people who are out there are trying to figure out what is happening, is that this is a highly transmissive virus. People can get it very easily, and it also can cause a variety of symptoms. These symptoms can be mild flu-like symptoms like sneezing, a general sense of unease, but at the same time they can also escalate to a severe respiratory infection, sepsis, which is a very difficult condition to handle, and of course even death. So this is something that both in terms of biology, which we need to have more insights on how to fight it, and in terms of clinical practice is different. And at this point, I will direct another question to Parajeya. The question is, why is this virus called the novel coronavirus instead of Wuhan coronavirus? I mean, it was found in China, in this place. Many things in medicine take their names after the place they were discovered. Why are we giving this name?
Okay, so there are two basic reasons. The first being that diseases that are named based on the geographical region that they are found in, especially with something as specific as the word Wuhan, which is a very specific city in the Hubei province of China. There is always a negative connotation associated with, associated with these nomenclature, these taxonomical systems. So, for example, there are various diseases found around the world, like the Nile virus, so on and so forth. What these things do is that there's always a subconscious association with this area or culture with the disease. And the WHO's research in the last 20 years or so has found that whenever there is a disease that is found in a certain area, and then the disease is designated that specific name, there is always a negative association with that area itself. So there's a negative effect on economy, there's a negative effect on culture, there's a negative effect on even the people themselves, because it robs them of their basic cultural identity and only associates them with this disease. And which is why instead of calling it the Wuhan coronavirus, which it does serve a logical purpose that, okay, this virus was found in Wuhan itself. So it makes some logical sense that we could call it that. However, it does not give two major pieces of information that is required in viral serological naming. So, for example, the first thing we need to know in the scientific designation is that this is the 2019 novel coronavirus. It gives us two major pieces of information. The first being that this is a novel coronavirus in the sense that this strain of the coronavirus has not been seen anywhere in the world before. And the other name, 2019, specifies the date on which it was found. So you see, it serves the function that it tells us which year this novel coronavirus was found. And this is a novel coronavirus that is different from any other coronavirus that we've seen. It's different even from SARS. It is different even from the Middle East respiratory virus called MERS as well. And of course, it is biologically very different from the other Coronaviridae family of viruses that cause the common cold. At this point, of course, it is important to ask what the symptoms and the signs are of the novel coronavirus. I direct this question to Christos.
Yes, exactly. Because when we meet a person, we ask his or her name, like my name is Christos, but how do I look like? And when it comes to the virus, usually the clinical presentation is fever, cough, and shortness of breath. It is important to remember that this feature can appear from 2 days to 14 days after the contact with a potential or a reassured or a person who already is diseased. This number, the time between 2 and 14 days, is very important to remember in the rest of our discussion. So if we have a person who has fever, cough, or shortness of breath, the common flu or cold symptoms in a time interval of 2 to 14 days after his or her contact with somebody who has the disease, it is very important to be cautious of the novel coronavirus. This is how the novel coronavirus infection looks like. But of course, it may escalate to more serious symptoms like septic shock, severe respiratory distress, and loss of consciousness, and a lot of other severe conditions, especially in people who have significant comorbidities. Comorbidities can include diabetes, cancer, heart failure, liver failure, renal failures, and many other serious conditions. And at this point, I will also go back to you with another question. My question in this point is, what is the source? No, excuse me. Who is actually at risk of the novel coronavirus? Who is more prone to this? Because, okay, this is the flu season, and you, me, and everybody can get a cold or a flu.
So to answer this question, I'm going to quote the WHO and the CDC. The people who are most, there is a risk stratification essentially of that determines who is most at risk. People who are most at risk are those who are living in China, especially in the Hubei province or associated with the Hubei province. So regions that are close to the Hubei province are people who live in those areas have the greatest risk. Followed by that are those people who have had a history of travel in or have been in close contact with somebody from this area in the last, in the last 14 days. So essentially, it is also taking into account your recent travel history or your contact with somebody who has recently traveled to the Hubei province at least 14 days before the onset of symptoms. And the third, of course, the third stratification is that those who are also at very high risk for getting the coronavirus are the many health workers who are dealing with patients who have been proved to have the 2019 novel coronavirus. At this point, of course, it is a pertinent question to ask. What is the source of the novel coronavirus?
Well, indeed an important question, but I'm afraid I don't have an answer. In the previous years, when we had the SARS of the MERS, we finally identified the source, which were the cats and the camels. In the case of the novel coronavirus, there is a high suspicion as far as snakes, cobras especially, are concerned, as far as bats are concerned. And yesterday I was reading a new article that correlated the virus with a specific kind of animal, the ant eater. All of these animals share something in common. This thing that is common is the fact that Chinese people used to eat them a lot. The virus strains that have infected people share a common DNA, a common RNA, have a lot in common, like 96 to 99% of common sequence of RNA bases with the viruses that we can find in these animals. So there is a high suspicion that the source is either bats or cobras. But to be honest, most of the viruses are naturally living in animals and are transmitting to people. The point here is that there was animal to people transmission in the beginning, but now people are transmitting the virus to other people. And saying all this, I become kind of afraid. So I will ask you, am I at risk here in Greece, in Europe, of contracting this disease? I'm really afraid after all this.
Of course, due caution is always advised, but for somebody living in Europe, the risk is negligible. Of course, in public health, we never say the risk is zero for anything. All of our mathematics and all of our calculations always state that there is some risk for everything. However, in realistic terms, the risk is almost negligible. You see, the problem here is that we are focusing on the coronavirus, which of course deserves all the attention that it's getting now. But this is also the flu season. So, for example, here in Pleven, the last 3 weeks, we were under a health emergency because there was an influenza epidemic and there was an influenza health emergency in Pleven, Bulgaria, where I live. So the issue here is that, okay, although the risk is negligible, right? There is a risk, but realistically, the risk for somebody living in Europe is negligible to almost zero. However, this does not mean that the risk for other influenza-like symptoms or other forms of influenza is zero. So my advice to anybody would be to follow the same precautions that you take for preventing the outbreak of the influenza virus and the various forms of common cold and influenza. And this precaution taking, for example, washing your hands regularly, covering your mouth while coughing, wearing a mask in areas where you think that there might be too many people in an enclosed space. These precautions are more important to take, and we should not forget that, even despite the fact that the coronavirus itself is not something that should be on the radar of everyday people who live in Europe, unless there is a specific travel history. That if you, for example, travel to China in the last 2 months at the most, there's a very negligible to almost nothing risk for getting the coronavirus. I also want to ask Christos, are there any we've seen that there are a lot of travel restrictions in regards to the coronavirus. Early this morning, the number of countries that have suspended, number of flight and aviation companies that have suspended flights from China has increased. Hungary, for example, has began, cracking down on not just migration, but also has a greater and a more higher number of screening procedures in place. Some countries have outright banned flights from China. So does this phenomenon of travel restriction mean that the novel coronavirus is at risk of becoming a global pandemic?
Well, this is a good question. To be honest, to give a concrete answer to this, we should go through the travel restrictions. Actually, traveling is the initial reason why the whole of the globe learned about the coronavirus epidemic. Some days before the Chinese New Year, a period of time when many people in China travel from one place to another to visit family and increase the risk of transmitting the virus and the disease, was the reason that the Chinese government announced what was happening in Wuhan, and the World Health Organization investigated the topic, and the CDC or the ECDC were motivated to work more towards this. Now, going through the guidelines of the ECDC, the European Center for Disease Control, we can see that traveling is allowed. You can travel to China, but you are not allowed, or you are not advised, of course, to get in contact with people who have the disease, with healthcare workers, or with people who are in close contact with them. And of course, you are not advised to taste or even go around markets and other places that you can find the meat, the cobras and the bats, and all the live or dead livestock that may transmit the virus. When it comes to traveling from China to Europe, this is also allowed. Actually, it has been proven that there is no point in checking every Chinese individual or any individual who comes from China at the airport. But the point is that in case you had met people who had the disease, you should be close monitored from 2 to 24 days, as we mentioned before. If you develop symptoms within this time period, you have to be more closely checked and monitored, but this is another topic that we will discuss further afterwards. But the thing is that we really don't need to panic on this notion. Traveling is something that is still allowed, so the precautions we take for traveling prove that there is no fear of a pandemic, but of course precautions are also of high importance and priority. And at this point, I will ask you something else. We spoke a lot about traveling worldwide. Let's focus a bit on Europe. And let's say that the coronavirus, uh, despite all these measures that we talk about, spreads in Europe. What will be the public health implications? What will be the scenario here in Europe in that case?
Okay. So with the current data that we have, we know that coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, affects mostly people who are susceptible. Um, it also causes mortality in subspecific demographic groups. For example, people with comorbidities like asthma, COPD, heart failure, renal failure, and so on and so forth, and in the old. So the issue here is that the R naught value, that is is a value that we use to describe how infective or how virulent a certain virus is. For the coronavirus, the R naught is not very high. It is at the R naught is roughly at 2. So, for example, if one person gets the coronavirus, they will spread it to 2 other people. For example, measles or mumps has an R naught of 15. So one person can infect 15 other people. The same goes on with other diseases as well. However, in Europe, we have a demographic shift. So more and more people across Europe are also aging. There are more older people now than there were before that in any other time in European history. So because of this of course puts these people at risk. However, a probable factor as to why there are so many cases in China and not so many around the world. At the latest count, I'm going to quote the latest situation report from the WHO. In China, there are roughly around 30,000 cases as of now. Around the world, excluding China, the number of cases are very small comparatively. And why is that? That's because we have managed to, cordon off and quarantine people who have come from China, screen them appropriately, and to those people who we suspect have the coronavirus, they are kept under, observation. They are given medications and everything. Although there is no specific treatment for the coronavirus, supportive treatment is administered. However, for there is no clear comparison between Europe and China. You see, the issue is that China is a very highly populated country. Not only is it highly populated, the population density is very high. And coronavirus, it has been found mostly in areas where there is a very high population density, which stands to reason. So, for example, in a place where there are a lot of people packed together, the virus will jump from one person to another person much more easily than in a place where the population is more spread apart. Europe, on the other hand, has comparatively fewer people, comparatively a lower population density. So the public health implication would be that, okay, if there is a coronavirus outbreak, for it to be an outbreak, you would have to see a certain minimum threshold of cases. So I think at the ECDC it is considered, I think at the start, for it to be considered as a big risk would be around 20 or 30 for it to begin to be considered as an emergency. But the issue is that the public health implications are twofold. There are a lot of people at risk. So the potential for once the coronavirus becomes an outbreak, then it can magnify into something bigger, provided that the conditions for this virus to spread are met. So, for example, if there is lower sanitation control, there is lesser hygiene, or lesser environmental medicine and less effective quarantine control. However, in Europe, the public health implications of a coronavirus outbreak would be limited at most. Europe has the advantage of being extremely well prepared in terms of not only predicting the outbreaks like these, but also managing to control them and quarantine the affected very fast, and has a lot of resources at its disposal. Of course, this begs the question that is the European Center for Disease Control prepared to deal with the novel coronavirus?
Well, apparently the answer is yes, or at least it should be yes. This evening I went through the website of the ECDC just to make sure that it is indeed prepared to deal with the novel coronavirus. And what I've seen is that there is, as you mentioned, a lot of resources addressed both to healthcare professionals and national healthcare organizations, and even to individuals like you, me, and other people who are not in the healthcare sector. There are very frequent reports of the situation, updated guidelines. There is even a link with, you probably already know that the Johns Hopkins University in the US has started a live platform where they monitor every new incident, any new case, any new update on the virus. So it's something like that, but in the European level. And so at the level of the ECDC, everything seems to be fine. They're as prepared as they can. But the matter is that here in Europe, we are a community. We are a community of member states, and each member state has its own organizations in national and in regional level. And normally, the ECDC facilitates and issues data and guidelines to all of them, and they have to make sure that they will apply them. Of course, the population, the way that healthcare services work is different from country to country, but hopefully there has been a great mobilization all over the continent, and the same principles adjusted to the specific conditions that apply to any country will be kept. When it comes to Greece, from my experience, I have seen that the authorities have already issued some specific hospitals and laboratories of reference where cases suspected for coronavirus infection are referred. In the past week, there were 2 suspected cases, one in northern Greece and one here in Athens. They were both referred to the appropriate hospitals. They were tested. Fortunately, the result of the test was negative, but this was an experiment that showed that everybody is ready and prepared to deal with a spread of the disease. And at this point, I am now going to ask you, it is kind of paradoxical, but when you deal with medical conditions, it's always better to prevent than to treat. So if we abide by this principle, why hasn't there been a complete lockdown in Europe for all flights coming from China and potentially from neighboring countries that have a lot of cases like Thailand or Japan, you know? So why don't we prevent rather than treat this way? What do you think?
Okay. So I'm very glad that I've got this question, because a Europe-wide lockdown of all flights coming from China indicates, well, number one, that the coronavirus is much more serious than it actually is. It induces in the population a sense of panic that is something that we have to try to avoid, because you see, public imagination takes a lot of forms, but like with so many zombie movies coming out, for example. The public imagination, especially on the internet and so on and so forth, is being gripped by the coronavirus disease being some kind of apocalyptic virus or apocalyptic disease, notwithstanding the fact that the coronavirus in itself is virulent, is serious for a subset of the demographic, and it is something that can be prevented if you follow basic precautionary measures. When you block or you turn off, you put a country under complete lockdown by another region, like for example, the European Union. If there is a lockdown of all flights that come from China, it is going to do only one thing. That is, it is going to reduce the flow of information between these two countries. It is also going to reduce the chances for resources to be allocated from Europe to China and also from China to Europe. So, for example, sometimes you have to send epidemiological officers or epidemiology intelligence officers from the CDC, for example, who go into China to track down the various ways that this disease has spread. This would not be possible if Europe was under complete lockdown. And Europe's lockdown, for example, condemns people who are already in China, who may not have the disease, because the vast majority of them don't have this disease. It takes them to the same standard as something as those with the disease, and reduces them only to the disease itself. So, for example, if for example today we block off all flights coming in from China, uh, all we are doing is we are just telling the population that yes, every person who's coming from China is coming with the disease. Even in the beginning of the outbreak, there was a ton of racial abuse being sent to people of China living in Toronto, in Canada, and other Western countries. This is unfair. Not only is it unfair, it does not do anything to solve the problem. If you want to solve the problem of the coronavirus, you have to tell people here in Europe that they must follow certain protocols in preventing the spread of this virus. We cannot, assign blame to China and say that the Chinese people are at fault, because essentially these public health policies often have a way of becoming xenophobic, and xenophobia does not help solve any kind of disease whatsoever. There is no medical evidence to suggest that complete lockdowns from any place have any kind of effect on the virulence of these places. More effective is that you just put proper screening protocols at the airports, and those who have the disease can be treated immediately, and those who do not have the disease are let go, because we have to respect the scientific fact that the coronavirus is not some kind of deadly virus that is going to cause some kind of apocalyptic event. It is something that is serious, but for the average European citizen it is not a problem. In these fragile times, for example, where we have seen a rise in the number of misinformation being spread. So, for example, there are many quarters saying that the coronavirus is a bioweapon, for example. It is not. There is no other way of answering this by saying other than saying it is not. You see, for anything to become a bioweapon, the minimum threshold for the virulence for this will be much higher. So, for example, an R naught of 100 would be where we would start if we have to consider something to be a bioweapon or not. But public imagination runs wild, and locking down flights does not do anything. It only causes much more economic harm. It causes racial and cultural misunderstandings between people, and it restricts the movement of resources from one region to the other. And of course, this also, like I've just talked about the racial issues stemming from this coronavirus, the unfair targeting of the Chinese people. We also have to ask: should we avoid Chinese food and Chinese products? And I would like to direct this question to Christos.
Okay, well, this is a great point, because moving of people is one thing, but we have a constant flow of resources and products, or even food from China. So I was discussing today earlier with some friends, and they were like joking, let's go to eat in a Chinese restaurant. But is it a thing that we can joke with? In terms of giving a concrete answer to whether we can suspect transmission of the virus through Chinese food or products, we have to go through the history of similar viruses in the past. This is the SARS and the MERS, and we can also focus on precautions. When it came to these viruses, and also to the paradigm of the and to the paradigm and the current knowledge of the coronavirus, what we know is that although it can be transmitted with respiratory droplets like sneezing, coughing, or even breathing, and it can penetrate even the eye, this is not the case with dry surfaces. The virus can live only for a restricted amount of time in dry surfaces. We don't know the exact amount of time, but definitely this is not the time that the product, even food, needs to come from China to Europe. So most probably, any virus that may have infected clothing, dry food, or anything from China to here will die on the way. So we are not really at risk of contracting the disease from just touching or consuming any product from there. Of course, when it comes to precautions, we should not consume any fresh product like dairy products, milk, meat, and especially the kinds of meat that we mentioned before. But in any case, we don't really have evidence proving that we are at risk of contracting the disease just from going to shop in a Chinese clothing shop or from eating in a Chinese restaurant. Of course, it is important to be careful. And at this point, I feel that we have finished with the Q&A. I would like to invite all the people who are on board to join the discussion. And I would just like to make two small points that may trigger some thoughts. The first thing is that, and Aparajaya already spoke a lot about this, a new phenomenon of racism against China and Chinese people. In the light of protecting ourselves and the a good health and sanitation status in the European Union, we may offend, and we don't always offend informal ways of offending. We can also offend with jokes. People from China and people who work there, people who came from there, people who are involved even in preventing and studying the disease further. So racism is an important thing that we need always to keep in mind when dealing with such things. The coronavirus may have started in Wuhan. It probably started because of poor sanitation and some habits of eating there. But in any case, it is a human problem, and humans all over the globe can get the disease, whether they are Chinese or Asians or Europeans or anything. Another thing that we need to discuss, and in this case, China probably has some responsibility, is traditional Chinese medicine. You probably already know that about 1 year ago, the World Health Organization issued the new ICD-10 classification, and in this classification, there was a chapter dedicated to traditional Chinese medicine and the conditions that it treats. So this gives a lot of legitimacy to traditional Chinese medicine, which is something totally different from the traditional, let's say, European medicine, the Hippocratic allopathic medicine that we all study and know. And nowadays, 1 year after that, having a new infection, an epidemic, and probably a pandemic from there, probably indicates that this paradigm of medicine is not so effective. Of course, Hippocratic Western allopathic medicine hasn't still found a solution for the problem. But the problem is that in a frame of traditional Chinese medicine, probably vaccination and basic sanitation rules were neglected. And this probably played a role in the beginning of the infection. So all in all, there is some responsibility of the perceptions of science and medicine in China, that this is something that we need to take into account, and this should be a paradigm for all the countries. But at the same time, we should focus on the human rights, the main aspects of the main pillars of European ideology and development, and we should not be racist at any cost. I would like to hear Aparajaya's view on this, and of course you are all welcome to unmute your microphones and even open your cameras and join this discussion now.
Christos, thank you for the basic background on this on the situation that we are facing right now. You see, the problem here is not that traditional Chinese medicine is the thing. Around the world, there are various systems of medicine that are that do not follow evidence-based medicines and the practice of Hippocratic or allopathic medicine. The issue here is that people often choose these medication forms over allopathic medicine, and there is some responsibility on behalf of the medical professionals themselves that there is some reason why, for example, let's take vaccination. The rate of vaccinations around Europe has decreased in some specific countries. For example, the anti-vaxxer movement is very strong in America. It's responsible directly for the outbreak of measles and chickenpox and mumps and so on and so forth. But the issue here is not just that. Of course, China bears some responsibility for this, but it's also a failure on the part of the Chinese government and the WHO that we have not doubled down on tackling sources of misinformation effectively enough. So, for example, there are many countries, and for example, in India, the Indian Health Ministry, for example, issued a statement that the Indian system of medicine, called the Ayurvedic system, has mechanisms in place for dealing with the coronavirus. They did not specify what mechanisms exactly they were going to use, and there is no evidence. You see, the problem here is that if, for example, something was considered, something met the criteria for evidence and evidence-based medicine, it would not be alternative medicine. It would just be normal everyday medicine. That is it. But what has happened with this, with China, for example, is two-pronged. Because the first thing is that, of course, they recognized the traditional Chinese medicine as, under the WHO, which I don't understand why exactly, what the reasoning and the justification given for this decision was. The second thing, of course, is that in China there was not enough enforcement of the law. So, for example, it is illegal to eat wild animals and exotic animals. There are hygiene standards and requirements that the Chinese government purports to adhering to. However, they did not do any kind of health inspection in these open markets, which are all known. So, for example, there have been tourists who have gone to these open markets to see civet cats and other forms of wildlife being sold, and in crates and cages and so on and so forth. The problem is that we can make as many laws as we want. There are laws for everything. I understand. It does not change the fact that the enforcement of those laws and the accountability that comes with this has not been followed through. So even in there is a doctor called Dr. Lei Liang, I think. I'm very sorry, I can't pronounce his name properly. He passed away on Friday. He passed away because of the coronavirus. He was one of the victims of the coronavirus. He was 34 years old. He was the first doctor to raise the alarm that yes, this cluster of pneumonias that he was observing did not come from any normal or known form of coronavirus or a known pathological organism. It came from something new. But this information was kept under control by the Chinese authorities for some time. And there is evidence to suggest this. This is not, this is a normal criticism that even Europe has issued against China. There are some parties within China stating that yes, more should have been done. But the problem here is that this governmental thing of having not enforced their laws properly, and aiding and abetting in cover-ups and things like that, simply because bureaucracy is sometimes paralytic. These are the things that cause more harm than eating at a Chinese place. So, for example, right now there is literally no problem with somebody going to eat at a Chinese place. You can go out and hang out with your Chinese friends. There is literally nothing wrong with that. The problem comes when we give credence to false news, and we give credence to either propaganda or outright racism and xenophobia for no reason. It is all right to feel afraid. Feeling afraid is a normal human response, especially to major disease outbreaks. But it is not justifiable for racism. It is not justifiable that you use this disease and associate people who are purportedly at risk for this disease with something else. So, for example, it is the easiest way to conclude what I'm trying to say is that, number one, of course, China as a government, as a nation, holds some responsibility. But the everyday Chinese person is not the coronavirus. They are not coronavirus patients in waiting. A Chinese person is a Chinese person. They are not the disease that you're trying to conflate them with. And in response to all the there is data that suggests that the virus has been found on doorknobs, for example. But it is not the live virus. It is not clear whether it can transfer from the doorknob to another person. And so far, most of the evidence suggests it cannot. But it is important to realize that the Chinese people are not the coronavirus disease. China, for example, is a country or a nation with almost a 10,000-year cultural history. We cannot reduce a cultural history and their identity just in the face of this disease. That disease does not make a person. A disease does not make a culture. And this is something that we need to focus on, because misinformation, outright lies, for example, false news, all of these things compound the problem further. Now, of course, when this coronavirus outbreak is under complete control, there has to be more movements into understanding what was going on in China that the outbreak decided to the outbreak went from 100 cases a day to now almost 37,000 cases today. We have to understand the social profile of what is going on there. There are reports coming out of China right now that people are being barricaded for no reason. They are being harassed by the police state for some reason or the other. But all of this there has to be a sense of accountability, and the WHO should step up its efforts to combating misinformation, combating governmental inefficiency, and holding governments accountable.
Are you okay, Dr. Shanker? Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Christos just sent me a message. He's having some connectivity issues. Okay. Dr. Bennett, is it possible for us to either receive some questions or something? Are there any questions from the audience or other members of the panel?
Yes, of course, of course. Okay. You want to open it? You want to open it up for questions, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Lolita, Asim, Valeria. Go ahead. Go ahead, Lolita. Introduce yourself and ask away.
I'm Lolita Matishova. Thank you, Aprajaya and Christos, for your interesting speech. It was really productive, informative. Opened for me a lot of information. I also want ask you, Aprajaya, about this how you say it, people obsessed about the coronavirus, about epidemic, yes, but people forgot about the flu. So yeah. I think maybe for us the flu is the more problem than coronavirus, and maybe we don't need so panic to coronavirus. What do you think about it?
Exactly. It's a very interesting point, Dr. Matishova. Thank you for mentioning this. So the basic issue is that in this panic about the coronavirus, we have forgotten that the flu is far more important for us to tackle around Europe, especially, and around countries that surround Europe as well. Even across the world, this is the flu season right now, and the flu is something that constantly changes. It constantly updates itself. The virus undergoes and so because of this, what happens is that we have forgotten that we need to focus on the flu right now. I'll take the personal example of Pleven, where I live. We have just declared a flu emergency. It has been a health crisis. The schools have been under lockdown, so on and so forth. This is what is going to happen in other places as well. You see, oftentimes when these major diseases come to the fore, even for example during the Ebola outbreak or the Zika virus outbreak, the Nipah virus in India, for example, our conversation was limited only to these specific diseases. We forgot that we need to combat not just the flu, but we also need to combat other things like cancer. We need to combat maternal mortality. We need to combat obesity, smoking. So these are the things that we need to focus on as well. Now, while the coronavirus is an important, it's important, but what has happened is that all of our news media channels are constantly obsessed with the coronavirus rather than, directing the conversation towards cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, which are very serious diseases. And there's a greater chance for getting these diseases, especially the flu, over getting the coronavirus. So it is a basic measurement of risk and risk analysis, basically, which is something that we are forgetting.
Well, I totally agree with this approach, and in my view, the whole incidence of the coronavirus showed something else, which is something positive. It is the fact that not only in Europe there is a high level of services that can anticipate and cope with any kind of emerging epidemic. In the last month, we saw a hospital appearing in 10 days, and we also saw a very serious effort of exchanging science between laboratories who dealt with decoding the RNA of the virus. And we also saw a very serious investigation from the WHO, the CDC, the ECDC, and the other major institutions. So this means that science nowadays, with its flaws and problems, with its financing problems, has the means to control, or at least to face in a decent way, such a very big and important problem. In this notion, it is actually a shame that today we have problems like anti-vaccination. We have people who don't get screened for cancer, even in areas where all the facilities, the equipment, and the information is available. So the coronavirus message, the take-home message could be like, we can do it. We have the means. Of course, we always evolve. We always learn from the past. We have to deal with issues like open information, open access, governments that deal with that don't disclose all the information on time. But we can manage it, and we should focus on other emerging health issues that, although we have the means to cope with, we don't really do well with them.
I completely agree, because you see, what we have learned about the coronavirus and the rapid response by which we had all the information available is nothing short of remarkable, for the simple reason that in human history, it is this age of information that we live in has given us the access to the information that we need very fast, democratically, and accessible anywhere in the world. So, for example, the gene sequencing done by Professor Zhao and his team at the Beijing Institute, I think, when they sequence the RNA, they sequence it within 10 days of receiving and 10 days of it being declared and known as a separate organism. They declared it, they found it, they sequenced the whole thing, and we got access to it immediately. Not just that, the live updates by the CDC, the European CDC, the WHO, the constant situation reports every single day with facts, figures, analysis, as well as directions as to what we as healthcare professionals should do is nothing short of remarkable. Something like this would have been unheard of in the 1950s, for example. So, and especially in the 1920s, when Spanish flu, for example, decimated 2% of the world's population. And it did so with the same conditions that the coronavirus is spreading now, because coronavirus is spreading because, it is highly virulent. But we are being able to fight against it simply because we have the information at hand. So the issue here is that we know and we are prepared. Should there be a coronavirus here in the European mainland, Europe is prepared to deal with it. Everyday people, as long as they follow the basic infection and infection control protocols, disinfecting their hands, living in clean spaces, washing their mouths, so on and so forth, the coronavirus will not, spread any further than it already has. There is a cause for optimism. I understand that a lot of people have died because of the coronavirus, and I understand that it is a human tragedy, but we have to sometimes look for the optimistic, we have to look for the good news among the bad. The good news here is that we can fight the coronavirus. It is something that we can fight against. We can prevent it, we can quarantine it, we can treat people, most of them at least, with supportive therapy. The lack of a specific antidote or a specific antivirus against the coronavirus is not something that is a huge detriment as it's made out to be. It's just, a lot of diseases don't have direct antidotes. A lot of diseases have only supportive care. And so supportive care is not as bad as not having a disease. And it's better than not having any access to medical care at all. So we have to weigh what we have in terms of resources and capabilities against what we are facing. That is the basic lesson that I want everybody who is watching live stream not to know that we have the capability to fight off this infection. We have the capability of quarantining it and keeping it under control as much as is possible. And the European, Center for Disease Control is well prepared. Our individual governments are well prepared to deal with this coronavirus. The one thing that we have to, we can be as well prepared as possible, but everyday European people or everyday people around the world need to do their part. That's the only thing. They just need to do their part. That is, follow what is being said to you by the WHO. Follow what the ECDC is telling you. Do not give credence to misinformation. If information checking or information verification is an important part of how to deal with public health emergencies, look for credible sources of information, look for the WHO, and follow what the WHO says. Even small things like washing your hands after having a meal, covering your mouth, sneezing into your jacket, even that is better than sneezing out into the public. And everybody can help. That is all I'd like to say.
Exactly, this is a very important future. And because you mentioned the Spanish flu back in the 1930s, I would like to make a short comparison with historical paradigms of these epidemic situations. You all know that you have here that I have a keen interest in history, by the way. So even before the Spanish flu, let's say when the Black Plague hit Europe, back right after the medieval times, or even in the antiquity when we had epidemics of the plague or epidemics that we literally don't know what the cause of death was, we already had the problems that today we don't encounter. At these times, there was no observation of the phenomenon. We only had the authors going around being afraid that I saw that people are all over the place and they are ill and their symptoms are probably like this. Or we have very abstract descriptions of the treatment, like this doctor there put fire and use this liquid and probably this could help. And of course, nobody had a single idea about the cause, and there was not a specific plan, a centralized plan of action. Today we have information, we have live communication, we have all the means that we could have to cope with this situation. Today is present, but our present is part of history, and all this incident is actually a very proud moment, some very proud pages of human history that will serve as an example in the future. And a last remark for me is that communication is a very important aspect, and probably it's the first time in probably human history where not only officials and authorities and scientists can communicate information, but also people like us, students or young professionals, can have a meeting like this, discuss it, have other people from all over the world. We are here from Greece, Bulgaria, the US, Ukraine, Pakistan, everywhere. We're discussing it. And this will be there for other people to have a look at it, to agree or disagree with it, to mention their comments. At this point, if there are not any other questions, I would like first of all to thank you, Parageia, for your proactive effort in organizing this discussion tonight. I would like to help the panel of the European Student Think Tank, the board who supported this idea. I would also like to thank your organization for embarking on this project and making this happen. Of course, John Bennett, who supports and dedicates his time and motivation and enthusiasm to this idea, and all of you, Lola, Asim, Anna, and yes, Asim. Feel free to speak.
Yeah. So
just introduce Asim. Asim, introduce yourself and let us know what do you think.
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate all of you for conducting a very informative session for all the participants and the attendees. I would like to welcome Shankar, who given a remarkable kind of lecture here. So it was very knowledgeable. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Asim Zubair. I'm President of Disease Control and Research Center. I would like to raise a couple of questions here. One of my question is from Shankar. It's like it's related to the media. What's the role of media in the recent outbreak of the novel coronavirus? Don't you think, Shankar, that the media, that the foreign media is kind of exaggerating the situation at the moment? Because if we compare the novel coronavirus as compared to the outbreak of H1N1 in 2009, the H1N1 was the reported cases were nearly 1.6 million, and the deaths were nearly 0.2 million, and the fatality rate was 17.4% as compared to Wuhan. Wuhan fertility rate is 2% only. So don't you think that the media is exaggerating at the moment, and just it's due to the economical aspect, you can say, between the US and the China, and there is some kind of exaggeration at this situation?
Thank you, Dr. Zubair, for your question. So I'll preface this by saying that I am not a national security expert. I can't tell you, and I'm not a political, I'm not a political analyst. I can't tell you whether the reason why the media is exaggerating this is because of the trade war currently between America and China. But what I can tell you from what I know is that there is a definite trend towards exaggeration in the media over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. So let's take the last 5 years, for example. We can divide the media response to everything in terms of, our social media experience, for example, where most of us get our news from, is always, it's unfortunately, because there's no other word for it, we are always looking for something viral. There's viral videos, viral memes, viral, and because there is a collective, shortage in the attention span, the media is trying to keep up with it by, putting out all sorts of weird numbers. For example, there was a number that was being quoted by a respectable media source. I think it was a CNN that said 1.9 million people at risk, 17 million people could die. Something like that. Something absolutely absolutely something designed to catch your attention. Numbers on their own don't mean anything. I can say 19 million, it doesn't matter. Of course, technically it is the truth that 19 million people who live in the Hubei province are probably at risk for getting the coronavirus. Yes, theoretically, every single person who's living there can have the coronavirus. But the issue in medicine is that in medicine, we don't look at reductionism. You cannot look at simply numbers and facts. When we look at a fact, for example, that fact is multi-layered. So for example, when we know that, okay, there is a 2% fatality rate, right? It does not mean that 2 out of every 100 people is going to die. That is a very simplistic approach. That 2% means that of the 2% who die, these 2 people who are going to die out of 100, if I'm going to make this even more simpler, these 2 people are going to die because they also have this comorbidity. For example, they have heart disease, they have lung infections from before, they have asthma, they have lung cancer. So the thing is that just numbers in and of themselves don't mean anything. And what has unfortunately happened is that we've lost the ability to have context. So, for example, if we look at the H1N1 virus, 17% at H1N1 is far more virulent and far more fatal than the coronavirus. You see, but the coronavirus is something that occupies the top news slots every single day. It has been doing so for the last month and a half. You see, and it's not just that. What has happened is that because we take a lot of our information on social media, like Twitter, for example, conspiracy theories abound. Anybody with an internet connection is going to write just about anything. I remember while I was doing the background research for this, somebody wrote that the coronavirus is a bioweapon. The Chinese government is using it to kill everybody. It is absolute nonsense. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But you see what it has done. While I was doing proper normal research, looking at journals and all that, just the word bioterrorism, China, and secret laboratory was enough for me to just click on it to look at what this is. Even if it turns out to be utter nonsense, what has happened is that it has grabbed the attention of other people. And now what we must understand in medicine is that as medical students, for example, I'm a medical student. Dr. Mateshova, who's with us, and Dr. Danchenko, who is also with us, they are doctors. They are doctors after 6 years of training. I have only 4 years of training. For just us, it is difficult to sift fact from fiction, to contextualize our information, to go through the data, and it takes time. For the average person, this is not possible. If they see a newspaper headline that says that the coronavirus is a bioterrorist weapon, they will believe it. That is the unfortunate reality that we live in. And it is our duty as doctors to be able to communicate to those people and say that, no, this is not true at all. And you are making a correct point, because what has happened in the media over the last 5 years, ever since 2014, with the advent of digital marketing and better advancements in computational technology, what has happened is that a lot of our information is being put into small bite-sized units that don't make any sense on themselves. By themselves, looking at the coronavirus, if you look at coronavirus and look at just the death rate. So for example, if I refer to the CITREP this morning, the number of deaths this morning is, I think 700, I think. Yeah, total new deaths is 812 since the start of this disease in coronavirus in China, for example. The total number of cases is 47,000. In and of themselves, these numbers don't really mean anything. We have to contextualize it. So for example, 812 people have died since the beginning of the coronavirus. 37,000 people have been infected since the beginning of the coronavirus in China. And China as a whole is a country of over, a billion and a half people. But the headline is always going to say 800 people have died. The death rate has surpassed SARS, for example, was one of the headline I read. Yes, the death rate has surpassed SARS, but the infection rate or the fatality rate is the same. It's in fact, it's even lower than SARS. So I don't understand what exactly, see, we can do a lot of things to combat this, but there is no easy solution is what I would say. And the other thing is that, for example, there is a book that I think everybody should read, whoever's watching the live stream. It's called The Plague by Albert Camus. So in that book also, he described what is happening now pretty accurately. So the context is that the plague is a story that happens in Algeria. A plague takes over a town, and people are panicked, and in that it is always the same thing. You see, misinformation kills more people than the disease itself. Now, because of this feeling that this is a bioterrorist weapon, or somebody eventually will come out and start selling something like a tonic or a supplement or something that is going to prevent the coronavirus from infecting you. We have to combat these things more actively, and not just proactively, but reactively as well. When we see misinformation, it is our duty as doctors to step in and say, no, this is false. I understand that this is an intellectually taxing. It's intellectually taxing, of course. It is not easy to keep saying the same thing again and again and again. But the WHO has to do this as well. On WHO's Facebook page, every day there is anti-vax. There are people who are concerned about vaccinations, for example. There is a difference between legitimate concern about some vaccination or a vaccine over paranoia. And the thing is that unfortunately we live in a world of paranoia, because paranoia is what gets you the most clicks. It grabs your attention very fast. So the only advice that I can give in my limited experience, because I'm not a doctor, so I can't tell you what it is like to be the chief of the of an institution. But in my opinion, from what I've seen work is, you have to go out there and talk to people and try to tell them that, okay, this is wrong and this is right. No matter how much energy and no matter how much effort it takes. It is our duty as doctors to be able to combat this kind of misinformation. It's a duty that we must adhere to, because without this, what is happening is that there is racism. Not just racism. For example, 21,000 people signed a petition in Toronto saying that all the Chinese students who had come to study at Toronto University should be quarantined and sent back. So in effect, they are saying that you are not welcome in our country. You can get out simply because you're Chinese and you might bring in disease. That is a very dehumanizing way of looking at people. And not to sound like an alarmist, but this entire concept of a certain people being associated with the disease is something that is rooted in Nazism. The gas chamber that the Nazis used were disguised as delousing units. You see, we have to prevent something like this. Although I'm not saying that in any country this kind of Nazi thing is possible, but it is the same attitude. And while paranoia is while being alert is, the basic motto that I would say that we should stick to is Be alert, but not paranoid. Be alert that yes, there are infections. It can happen. There is a possibility, whatever, but not paranoia. Don't go around saying that okay, no, we should avoid this and avoid that and lock ourselves in our houses and think that blow this disease out of proportion. There is a proportion, and that's what we need to tell people. And also we have to inform them that context is important. Without context, without the data in it of itself means nothing. The data has to be contextualized for it to make sense. There is a reason why statistics is an entire field. Medical statistics is a separate field. There's a reason why public health people need to train themselves to be able to use this, because just facts in and of themselves are often misleading. And it's our duty in conclusion, I just want to say that it is our duty to tell people and to allay their fears about this disease, because it is the duty of us as medical students to promote health, but also to combat something that is going to cause more damage to people. A lot of these supplements, for example, we don't know what's in them. There is no evidence to suggest that drinking something made out of zinc, for example, it can cure coronavirus infections. It can't. There is no evidence. If there is evidence, then let us look at the evidence. Let us appraise the evidence. If the evidence stands up to it, then okay. That's a separate process. But insofar as evidence, claims are being made, numbers are being thrown around without context, and it is our duty to provide the context. In conclusion, I mean, of course, I'm going way out of time here, but in conclusion, I want to say that we have to talk to people, and we need to also praise people who are already talking to people. On YouTube, there are many doctors who are also are big influencers in the social media sphere. They have all taken it upon themselves to go out and speak to people, which is what we must also do in whatever way possible. You can begin first by talking to your colleagues. You can begin first by talking to your patients. You can begin first by talking at your university. And from there, it can become a bigger movement to combat misinformation like this.
Well, I would like to ask one thing more, that there's a theory that the current novel coronavirus is mutated from SARS, as the genetical analysis suggests. So what's your take on that? And also, are the current antiviral medicines a bit able to control this pandemic if it's suppressed to India or Pakistan? Or any other country in the Europe, as this chat is confined to the Europe, right?
Okay, so there are three things to unpack here. The first thing is that it is a theory that maybe the current coronavirus is descended from SARS. The problem here is that evolutionarily it is possible. It is possible that it is either a new strain of the previous SARS disease, but it is also more possible that this is completely new in terms of how it has mutated. You see, the problem here is that the genetic similarity in and of itself does not always mean that there is some kind of link. Plus, coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, is more in connection and has more in common with beta coronaviruses that we know from before. So it is likely that it is a new mutation that is caused, that comes from something that only existed in bats before, but has now evolved to form the novel coronavirus. And of course, in terms of viral medication, unfortunately, we don't have enough data. Now, in terms of the theoretical, it is possible that yes, antiviral medication of some type can work. But there was a study. There was a study by it was not a study per se, but a coronavirus patient was declared virus-free after she was given some kind of AIDS medications. The problem is that this is not a study. It's just a case. It's a case study. There is no way for us to extrapolate that data from just one patient. You see, one patient can defeat the coronavirus in whatever way they want, in terms of medications working, but it is not always possible to assume that it will work for all other patients. Also, the other thing is that yes, there is, I think, remdesivir, I think, which is a potential viral medication, antiviral medication that can be used. However, until there is more data, I would not say that there is. I wouldn't say that there is enough data to convince somebody that direct antiviral treatment will work for this disease. You see, the thing is that we have only just managed to sequence it. We don't know its evolutionary history. We don't know its phylogenetics very well. But we do know that what its molecular targets are. So, for example, there is a theory that states that it works, that the coronavirus, acts on the ACE2 receptors in the lungs. Now, the thing is that we can try to interrupt that pathological process. but I'm not sure if there's sufficient data for us to recommend this as standard practice as of now. So for example, if it breaks out in Pakistan and India, those two countries where the virulence risk is very high, I'm not sure if in good faith, because there is not enough data, I'm not sure that I would say that, you should give them antiviral medication. Unless more studies come out, I would rather say that it is better to follow the tried and tested mechanics of quarantine, observation, supportive care. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much for your answer, Shankar.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you all for your attendance today or tonight, depending on your time zone. I hope that we all learned a lot. We exchanged important opinions, and in the European Student Think Tank, we hope that we will be able to establish a series of online meetings, online chats, online lectures on similar topics from now on. So stay hooked, and we'll also update you on this. Are there any other points, or shall we conclude? Okay, I think we can conclude now.